would like to ask first, on stage, my distinguished co-anchor, who is definitely not a co-anchor, just like to call him that way, but he's a heart and soul of this conference, cooperating with the organizing authority. Please give a big round of applause to Dr. George Tilash. Not finished yet. Dr. George Tilash is founder and president of the PHI Institute for Augmented Intelligence. Besides being a senior global innovation and AI expert and executive, he's also a consultant primarily in the transatlantic space, from Fortune 20 tech corporations to government leaders on all continents. For over 20 years, he's been building bridges across sectors and industries between AI ecosystems worldwide. George is headquartered in Silicon Valley, but he's circling the globe in pursuit of delivering on PHI Institute's mission. And since he knows all the guests we have here and have worked with them beforehand, he's going to be asking a little different questions from me. On this note, I'd like to have our distinguished other members of the panel on stage in ABC order. A researcher of the Dutch National Laboratory for AI in Education, a graduate of the Social Research Methodology PhD program at the London School of Economics, who is now supporting the development of AI-based solutions for primary and secondary schools, Mr. Imre Báth. Try to say your last name first. I mean, your name last, but you recognized yourself, of course. And the global leader of delivery, quality, and transformation cloud services at T-Systems International, where part of his portfolio is automation and applying AI in improving customer delivery, as well as internal processes in TSI. Please welcome Mr. Erik Sloten. Everybody's got a microphone on their own. And just one more thing, Mr. Báth, George told me that you have a very special, kind of unique task with a pretty well-known company outside Holland. What is it exactly?
Yes, I have to start with a kind of full disclosure, transparency type statement. I kind of wear two hats. I am a researcher at the Dutch National Laboratory for AI in Education, but at the same time I've been a safety analyst, a trust and safety contractor with OpenAI for the last little over a year. So I have a little bit of an insight into those spaces, although my role at OpenAI is tiny, but it has been fascinating and I guess important maybe for these types of conversations.
George set the themes for the 4 pillars of this conference beforehand that we shared with you on the webpage, but let me sum it up really shortly for those of you who haven't paid close attention to it. Big enterprise, especially digital frontrunners like tech platforms, telcos, and media develop and roll out AI products. That's a fact. They also manifest a wide range of methods and practices to ensure the de-risking of those products. And thus they also ensure competitiveness rooted in AI consumer trust. This is rather a question that I'd like to start the conversation with. And Dr. Tilash set the magic number of 4 for the topics of the sub-conversations, the panels as well. First of all here, how to prove trustworthiness from the developer and the provider company side. Second of all, how to see the path to compliance once the guardrails are laws. Third, what's the role of big enterprise in delivering social value, that is, beneficial AI for society at large, of course, in a multi-stakeholder environment? And of course, how or should executives define the right mixture or ratio of innovation and regulation? Let's start with the first, proving trustworthiness. And let me first ask the 2 devil's advocates in the middle, maybe.
So one of the statements that I wanted to make is that about 2 years ago, Maria, who will be our next keynote, and I have been working on a major study for the World Economic Forum. And I think that Microsoft and Deutsche Telekom were 2 of the companies that have been named by us as responsible AI champions who have been, going down that road of coming up with that. OpenAI was not that visible at that time, but a lot of it has changed ever since. So basically, one of the statements that I wanted to make and ask your opinion, your perspective from the companies that you're associated with. I see that in the world, most of the platforms and the big tech companies have realized that it is an absolute must to gain the trust of society for the seamless implementation of all the AI technologies and products that they have been working on. So what is your personal take beyond the ones that you have already mentioned, Adrian? And this is a question to all of you. Where are the emphasis points? How did you operationalize the responsible AI principles inside the companies? And what are the specific areas that you are most concerned with or the most bullish about in your company?
So I would say in Deutsche Telekom, which has branded itself very much as a reliable German, quite conservative where it comes to dealing with data of its customers, the principles go very much along the line of being very protective of its individuals. And as a telco, we've always been very strongly regulated, but also typically, telecommunication technology was launched way before we introduced any regulation. So it was only from the 90s or later even that we were regulated on what data we could keep from traffic of people making phone calls, what should be shared, used ourselves, what do we need to provide to the government for security purposes. And the discussion was very much the same. So when you collect raw data, and this is not just personal data, but actually mostly not, also a lot of not personal data, because we use it for improving our services, making our services more robust, faster, more customer friendly. We're looking at usage data, we're looking at behavioral data of technical elements in our services, and the principles are very much about how would you hold an employee accountable. It is pretty much the standard of how you would hold an algorithm or an AI that deals with services or decision making, or at least triggering a certain decision accountable. So what you saw with Microsoft was actually quite similar. So Deutsche Telekom has started implementing in its network, which, by the way, Deutsche Telekom is owner of Magyar Telekom as well. So also these principles were applied here. In its network, in its IT services, in its customer service. And there, initially, AI was only used as a kind of assistant to strengthen the operation and be faster to come to a conclusion, but still for the human colleague to override the AI at any point in time, which is, if you know how fallible human beings are and how good AI is, sometimes it's questionable whether you want a human being to override an AI, but okay, let's say from an ethical perspective, which we had a very good discussion about yesterday, Deutsche Telekom stuck to that principle of the decision is still with the human colleague and on the principles and the standards that we hold all of ourselves. We are all responsible for. The outcome of the AI needs to be measured in the same way.
Yeah, from a Microsoft perspective, we could take it from 3 different work streams, actually. The internal one, for example, we want to develop, let's say, an AI-enabled system with a government. There are some limitations on the kind of use cases we can implement. There are some definitions of forbidden use cases that we'll have internally in the same way we have in the regulation, just to make sure that we apply AI in a way that we consider responsible based on our definition. That is also compliant with the next definition of what a fair AI will be. And also like that we work with companies that are like adopting our responsible AI approach. A good example will be like now we are talking about the OpenAI, no? The Azure OpenAI, which is a service like the OpenAI service, but on the Microsoft Azure cloud. And there was like a very long and detailed form in order to gain access to the service, in which we'll asking adopters to say, how are you planning to use the system? these are the forbidden uses. This is the intended use of the system. You need to prove that you are using it for one specific use case. If you want to add a second one, you need to ask for permission, because we can see, obviously, if you are using it for something that is not supposed to be. And this is like a preliminary measures, interim measures, to make sure that everyone is being responsible in the way they are applying generative AI in times in which it could be a bit risky. But then we apply it in a third way, not only internal and with adopters, also internal but with our customer-facing products. You have seen like Microsoft Bing, the search engine, from Microsoft. And you have probably seen like the Microsoft team led by Jordi Ribas in Barcelona in the United States. They were explaining the step-by-step process during the first weeks, every week sharing the result or their exploration of their adjustments when we were all learning about large language models, and saying, yeah, we have adjusted the number of sessions because otherwise it becomes a bit too heavy, the kind of answers we are getting from the algorithm. And we have added like countermeasures for content safety, because we don't want anyone to talk about violence, sexuality, etc. to our systems. So these are the building blocks that, I mean, on the slides it's easy to say, we are doing this and that, but these are the specific building blocks that we are putting in place every day in order to make sure that this is going to happen in that way.
I think I'll just briefly say something about the kind of Dutch National Lab on AI in Education, which is sort of in the process, I think, of figuring out how to actually operationalize the large set of principles that now exist. I think the big challenge facing the field now is that we have lots of principles and lots of guidelines, and it now really comes down to translating it into practice every day across multiple layers of an organization or an institution or whatever entity one is working at. And the approach that we're trying to pursue is based on several pillars. So we are developing educational technologies for the primary and secondary education sectors in the Netherlands. It is a government-funded initiative. It is foreseen to last at least for 10 years, and then there's an additional sort of scale-up phase. And every year we launch 10 prototypes, which are piloted and tested in schools with real feedback from real students and real teachers and real school boards. And we're pursuing a co-creation-based approach. So we believe that one of the core pillars of responsible AI is to involve affected stakeholders from the very beginning in deliberative and participatory exercises. So we start with discussions about what the needs are on the ground in schools. And then we try to articulate a question that can be addressed with AI properly, because I think there's also an issue that we are very quick to run to AI-based solutions because it's the sexy, hot thing, but it might not be appropriate to every problem. So we spend quite a lot of time articulating the right question and trying to see if AI is even the right solution. And then we pursue this embedded ethics-based approach where we have researchers with ethics backgrounds, with legal backgrounds, with scientific backgrounds in pedagogy and domains related to education, who kind of accompany the entire process of the product development. And then in the scale-up phase, where these things are then actually rolled out on a larger scale, we also try to define requirements that have to be in place so that not only the development process is responsible, but also the way in which it is actually implemented in schools. Because maybe there's a little bit less focus on the maintenance of these tools over time. We spend a lot of time talking about the development cycle and model audits and things like that. But there's an aspect which has to do with business practices and business processes and governance over a longer period. So we try to tackle that aspect as well, from question articulation all the way to how it is rolled out in the world.
I would stick to what he just said with maintenance, because that's something that I'd not like to slip over, because on the timeline, on the long run, of course, we are at the moment of forming the regulations, and we're going to be talking a lot about compliance and the path to compliance, which is part of the 4 questions to you at the beginning. But let's keep in mind maintenance on the long run and monitoring maintenance. How is that possible? Who should do it? How should it be done? And how do we trust it's being done?
And can I add one question on top to Imre's? And I'm going to play the role of the tabloid journalist here. So, are you one of those thousands and thousands of people who are trying to jailbreak GPT-4? Is that what your mandate is about?
Jailbreak GPT-4?
I mean, yes, safety on the safety side.
On the safety side?
Yeah.
Not specifically. So I'm on the scaled, and I'm not entitled to represent OpenAI. The company is very particular about who is allowed to speak on their behalf, and I have a very tiny role. But yes, I'm on the scaled enforcement team, which is basically trying to understand the ways in which people are using the technology and how they are trying to abuse it, and to try to find ways of preventing that abuse, or once it's found, shut it down quickly. So there's a lot of collaboration with the policy arm of the company, who sets guidelines, and then there's the challenge of translating those policies into practice. So the other collaboration arm, I guess, goes a lot to the engineering team.
Sorry, back to your original question.
That'd be a very interesting topic to explore for the whole panel, but so maybe back to maintenance. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for doing all of this in English, and congratulations to the two ladies that are in charge of translating it all into Hungarian. Maintenance, as in maintaining the data, cleaning it up, withdrawing it, and it's a very big question. So. Monitoring outcomes is only one, and keeping it ethical and making sure that it stays within a certain framework. It's almost, well, it's the easiest part once you agree on the ethics that you want to use, because you just have to monitor the outcome and calibrate it if it doesn't hit the ethical standards that you apply. But the maintenance and the collection mechanism of data, and what data you should or should not use, or whether you even know that your data is being used, and whether you are in charge of which data is being used, these are much bigger questions, which we've been debating the last 2 days. But those need to be solved, in my view, and also I think in Deutsche Telekom's view, those needs to be solved first. Just like you have, without a phone number, you're not able to use any phone network. In the internet and in AI and in all these digital solutions, you could have thousands of them, and they could be fake, yes, or people could create them on your behalf and you wouldn't know about them. And AIs get skewered based on all that raw data that they're using, based on all that fake data as well. So the question is, what do you feed the beast with, and then how do you maintain it afterwards? So it actually starts before the maintenance. And I think policymakers, as well as companies, need to very seriously look at the cleanliness of the data, and longer term also, we need to own our own data. You need to be able to opt in and out. And there are companies that allow that, Microsoft one of them, Deutsche Telekom is also one of them. But we do it in a very rudimentary way right now. It needs to be much more thorough. All companies need to be held to the same standard. And all citizens need to be held to the same standard, but also have rights on data. Right now, there is no real international standards as to how you can decide whether somebody owns your data, yes or no. There are a lot of policies, and there's a lot of developments in different countries on that, but there isn't one where we say the world, or even Europe, agrees to saying, you are a digital citizen, this is your ID. All of the digital data that's out there is connected to this one ID. You can pull it back, or you can disappear entirely, except for the government, obviously, because they will also always know where you are. But everyone else, commercial companies, should be regulated in that, as well as the fact that you need to be able to. The transparency part is not just about the algorithm. The transparency part is about the pure existence of your data and where it is and how it's used. Can
I just ask you a really layman question?
Sure.
The damage that's already been done, technically, can it be undone?
I told you the answer to that yesterday, so but yes, partially yes, but no. I think the damage is so big and it's so irregulated so far that at least the conclusions that have been made so far cannot be withdrawn, and you cannot trace it back to all the unstructured data that has already been collected. But that doesn't mean that you cannot start with it now, right? And at least for identity-based data, that you have somehow distributed by using an app or using a phone number or even being visible in some store or something like that, that stuff can still be withdrawn. Yes, and yes, a lot of other things, which is less, let's say, directly connected to your personal identity or to some ID that you have created on some portal. No, I don't think it's technically possible to clean all of that up. But it's still not too late to at least stop the damage getting bigger than what it already is.
So when designing this conference, I think I put an oversized emphasis on big platforms and big companies being present, because one of the things that I became convinced throughout the years is that whatever is happening right now around this regulatory wave is by and large, and it's going to be an oversimplified statement, but I think it's still valid, it's going to implement a lot of these practices that these big companies have introduced internally throughout the years because of competitiveness. So there was no, there was no AI dedicated regulatory requirements to meet. It was just the pressure from the customers and pressure from society and civil society and the press. And I really love the approach that Microsoft developed, especially because it sometimes goes above and beyond. Brad Smith, your president, who we had the chance to collaborate with once in a while, he kept talking about extended responsibility of companies for a while. I don't know if he's still doing that, but I really love that, that term of his. So can you please elaborate on some of the juicier practices that you're doing, like, for example, killing big projects, big AI projects, if you think it's too unsafe? Because Brad is talking about that a lot, like, that they have a committee and then you're announcing that you actually killed a big project.
Okay. Let me try how juicy this can be.
Okay.
Now, I'll take 3 examples. I think I always use like 3 things to explain my thought process. There was one example during the pandemic that was related to student data being processed and using it for whatever purpose, for educational purpose, I mean. There was an agreement, and this was something that Microsoft decided to do with the Spanish government. There was an agreement called the Guernica project, in which Microsoft said, okay, we have handled this information in an exceptional way with our data centers, because they had models, or whatever models they were using, they were in the United States. We agree on that. That was something that the government knew. But we were well aware that this data should be stored totally in Spain. So what we'll do is to repatriate the data, to delete it from the American servers, and to bring it back to the Spanish society, because this is the kind of approach we want to implement. Obviously, we have the national regions for data centers and stuff. But that movement of, hey, the data was already there, bring it back, repatriate, and making the point on that to say this is the way to collaborate, I think that was very useful from that point of view. There is another thing, another initiative that is unique for Microsoft Spain. Actually, they created like a head of employability, kind of role in order to train people. And by people, I mean the society, the adopters, the integrators, everyone, artificial intelligence, because they consider that the best way to adopt is to understand. If you understand the potential of the technology, you understand the risk, and then we can bring that kind of shared responsibility, and we can be ready for regulations, adopter, provider, etc. So I think that was another example of how to go above and beyond, not just for purely commercial purposes, but also to help with society. So these are very good examples. The third one is the EU the data boundary agreement. That's something that Microsoft decided to do. They say, okay, we will put in a paper the engagement to say the data is not going outside of the European Union. And that's something that we are pioneers in doing that, and that we are very proud as a company, because again, we are anticipating some anticipating some needs. The same with the AI Act, when we are talking about watermark on the products, that all other companies are doing the same, but we are anticipating because we know that, yes, there is a pressure from customers, and this is something good, no? There is a pressure for clients, adopters, but also it's a good thing to do as a company. So I think like, I don't know if your notion of juicy, but for me it's juicy enough.
It's pretty juicy. And talking about watermarking technologies, what is your take? You know, OpenAI, I think just shut down its project of like being able to identify AI-generated text. Can you talk about that?
Again, I'm not entitled to talk on behalf of, but I would love to pick up on this topic that you brought up with the industry, the role of industry. And I think I'm sort of the outlier on this panel because my primary affiliation is with a public institution that is acting in order to increase kind of the delivery of a public value, namely education. And we are in a really interesting position because we're actually collaborating a lot with the private sector, both large enterprises and also small startups, and also helping to start new initiatives. And I think if there is one strong feeling that I have about this space is that the overrepresentation of industry is just profound, and it has been profound for the past at least a decade, right? So there was a very interesting publication in the journal Science a few years ago which looked at metrics of how public institutions compare to the private sector, and there is an enormous brain drain that goes from the best universities to the top technology companies. Public institutions cannot compete on salaries. Top companies have access to most computational resources, and they have access to most data as well. So there's a massive imbalance here. And while I do believe that companies are not to be pursued as, construed as being, evil in any way, but I think we do have to recognize that they operate according to certain logics, the logics of the market, and the market dictate a drive towards increasing shareholder revenue and increasing market share. And competing with all the other actors in the space. So I think we have seen the overemphasis and the high influence of industry on things like the EU high-level expert group on ethics. The amount of lobbying expenditure by big tech companies has really skyrocketed, also in relation to the EU AI Act. So I think there's a fundamental problem here that we have become dependent and reliant on the skill set and the know-how and the technology of the largest technology providers, which are not necessarily there for the public benefit, right? So can we think about ways and constellations that really prioritize public interests and public values? And that probably starts with a massive investment in the space beyond the regulation. But I don't want to come across as anti-big tech. I just think we have to recognize there's a certain logic here that might not be prioritizing public values.
I agree with you that it's a rebalancing act that we need in many aspects. And actually, now you just mentioned the brain drain. Maybe we can elaborate just for a few more sentences that the same what you were talking about regarding the public sector and talent in the public sector especially applies in academia as well. So everybody who's in AI, like an AI professor in academia, not everybody, but like most people have some affiliation with one of the major tech platforms, and therefore certain research areas are, let's say, prioritized. Some of them are deprioritized, and everybody I know in academia, in AI academia, thinks that this is a major issue that we need to rebalance. Eric, you wanted to say something, I think? No, not before.
So, no, I agree that there's the most investment is done by the big companies, and not necessarily only for the benefit of the customer, but also for our own benefit. That goes without saying because we're a profit-driven operation. But doesn't mean that we're not holding ourselves accountable to standards. Especially I would say the two companies here present on the panel have championed those values. So I don't want to subscribe to us just launching AI only to benefit from it ourselves without our customers.
And actually, now that you're talking about it, sorry, the first time you and I met, I think we started discussing it, that was like 3 years ago maybe. We started discussing that the pressure of your customers, you being on the implementation side, is already there regarding, ethical AI principle and AI ethics policies being there in the company. So but
also to implement AI. So it's not just do it ethically, but they're also not cool with you not using it. So you have to be like, we serve companies like Shell or the European Space Agency. It's not a company, but still a very large organization. And they have, response times which are almost not humanly possible without AI. They have They want to be warned years ahead of certain trends. They want to be advised on end of life or any trends that predict on their side even outages. So they want really, really high-end services. And still then we need to apply them in an ethical way. So it is not a discussion on whether we are going to use AI or not. Yes, and even I would say our first talk was about a lot of people are starting to think about it now, but have actually already used it for a decade at least. Yes, and so the question is how do we now, just like any technology, like the press or the phone or the car, which are also can be used as weapons, right, or can also be used to the great detriment of humankind. Now it's time for AI to do the same, and just because it's more complicated and more all-encompassing, for me the best solution would be to simplify the discussion, and I like the fact that you show those standards because they're very simple, very high level, but to simplify the discussion, say what are really the things, what is really the ethical part that we're so worried about? Are we worried about the protection of our identity or our data, or are we worried about the fact that we're getting decisions made about us which are skewed or biased, or are we worried about the fact that there's an organic process between the collection and the decision making that we don't understand and it's not transparent enough, or should it be hosted in Europe? Does it even matter whether it's hosted in Europe, yes or no? It's another discussion. Those, I think, very fundamental discussions, which I think we can have here in Hungary, but we should have internationally for it to be really relevant. Yeah, so.
Maybe not only to simplify, but also to make it tangible. We were talking about the principle of transparency. What does it mean, transparency? There are plenty of definitions, but the AI Act, for example, if we take that as a reference, it's talking about transparency with requirements of what kind of information you're using, the data sets, specific requirements for generative AI, the model life cycle, etc. The moment we make it tangible, we have a standardized format, we have a list of requirements, a piece that we can create by hand or automated with our MLOps. I think that in that case will become more or easier to understand for the companies and easier to adopt, because it's not only the simplicity of the concept, but also the having it in front of you. Okay, this is a representation of what the transparency means. We'll be leading to that like in a few months. It's not only a regulation, but also what kind of file we're creating. If it's a JSON file, where are we storing this? Up to now we are saying a central repository, European repository. What does it mean? It's a central database. It's just the website of the providers and adopters to put something like that. If you have an elevator, no, with some sort of AI doing for maintenance, do you have a QR code? These basic things will become a reality at some moment, and I think that will help everyone. They will understand the principle of transparency and what we mean by that on the notion of the AI Act.
And most importantly, accountability. So if an AI, so transparency is one thing, but who's accountable when a mistake is made? Yeah? When a person makes a mistake, is the person accountable? Can you fire him? Yes or no? Can you put him in prison? Yes or no? You cannot put an AI in prison, clearly. Can you put the developer that wrote the code in prison? Probably not. Or you can try, but does it help? Don't know. Can you hold the, so where is the level of accountability? That's a big discussion in Deutsche Telekom right now. Like, if you decide to deploy a use case, even if a committee of wise men has reviewed it and said, okay, it's ethical, yes or no. So once you pass the committee of wise men, there's still the chance that it gets biased or coders are also human beings, make mistakes. Even AIs are limited to what they are provided with. So who is then accountable for this? Like, we run a very large operation hosting 24-hour high availability solutions for many large companies that serve the world, like Shell or something like that. So if our AI that does the monitoring for Shell makes a mistake and there is damage to a human being, forget about the financial damage of Shell. Yeah. Okay, they're very rich. But a human being, who is accountable for this? Is it the AI, the creator of the AI? And that part, which you always hear about in science fiction movies, but that actually becomes a really relevant discussion. I don't know the answer. But we need to find simple, basic rules around transparency, but also about accountability. Who is responsible and accountable for the result of a conclusion that triggers something that damages you? Who? Who is responsible when you drive your car into another human being? You are, because you are driving the car, not Ford or Hyundai. But who is responsible when the AI makes the mistake? Ethically, I would like to hear the answer.
I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. I just want to, you both made attempts to simplify, and I just want to make it more complicated again, a little bit. I completely agree with the fundamental importance of transparency and accountability. But it's so interesting that these issues, the examples that you gave, are all instances where the harm is very directly tangible, right? It's just very clear. Someone died, someone was injured, someone suffered like representational harm. So those things we kind of have a grasp on, but going back to maybe the education example, the space in which I work and to which sort of the keynote, the opening presentation also alluded to, especially with generative AI, we're introducing very fundamental changes into societal practices. Like we're changing human relationships, we are changing teacher-student relationships, we're changing interpersonal relationships, and it's very hard to even understand what the issues are there. Like what does it mean when people start to relate emotionally to a chatbot, and they start to have like genuine human emotions towards them. And we are rolling these systems out on a very, very large scale without really understanding what even the short-term implications might be. So I'm fully on board with the accountability. They are fundamentally important, but I think there is still a logic of a race to come to market and to be the dominant player without really having a proper evaluation and pre-market assessment, in a way, pre-market assessment of the technologies that we are bringing to market. And when it comes to these softer consequences, we have a lot of work to do to understand and anticipate what consequences might unfold and how to mitigate them.
I'm very much with you on that. So I'm fearing the big blasts and the big booms of like threats that are emerging in the moment, in the now, and you have to deal with them the way you would treat a cyber attack or something like that. No, I'm much more worried about the undercurrents in society that we realize way too late, like years down the road. But Adrian, I see that you're publishing a lot about, customization of generative models in company settings, and you're proposing lots of different ways of doing that. I know that this is one of the most hairy issues when it comes to accountability, that, when a large online platform is deploying, or some of the foundational models are being deployed in one of the customized manners possible. How come these accountability issues, like what kinds of issues arise? And I know that a lot of the big platforms are, let's say, having a deep conversation with the European Commission regarding these, and the Parliament regarding these. So do you have any related experience coming out of the ways that you're proposing and the nuances of that?
Yeah, we take, again, the regulation as because we're talking about accountability. I personally like we were talking about ethical AI, responsible AI. Now we are going towards accountable AI. Yeah. And I think that that's the actual thing. That's how we all get to be ethical and responsible, is by having accountability. Accountability, of course, is not an answer of who is the provider of that software. It's both of them. The regulation will say that in the same way we were talking about controller, processor, and GDPR. And the generative AI case at Microsoft has been very interesting, because you see the strategy has been, in a commercial way, has been like very successful, and they have been releasing this kind of models, etc. But it's not about the model. That's what we said in the beginning. The product is not the model. It's everything around that. So the main two features that I see within the Azure AI platform, for example, one of them is the content safety. You were talking about people getting romantic with a chatbot. Well, we are avoiding that. We are saying if you are another company, except if your business is for people to get romantic with that's another topic, we will be stopping this kind of discussion. You can see the example in Bing Chat. No, people were saying Bing Chat is becoming boring. No, it's becoming like more issues, because people are trying to talk about violence, about these kind of things, and we are cutting the discussion based on monitoring mechanisms. So that's one thing. When you are talking about the kind of things that I'm publishing these days, it's about customizing also the implementations. People think about the fine-tuning, the retuning the model. It's not only about that. It's about combining a powerful model that has this conversational capability with your own data, that for sure you can rely more on your own data in theory than in any other data. So this is what we call the grounding techniques, and that's what companies are doing in addition to the content safety measures. And then there are like the things that are on the papers. On the papers, I mean like on the documentation, the transparency note, for example, saying this is how you should use the product. These are intended use, which is very aligned with regulation. This is the way you should use the product. We are well aware that there are other ways it could be used. That's part of the regulation also, thinking in advance. And countermeasures, what can we do? Can we disconnect the model? Can we stop if there is a negative development? This is the kind of thing that we are seeing day to day, and this is working on the projects in the field.
It helps also if you make it clear that it's an AI, right? So one of the deceptive things is that most companies, or especially in the beginning, they didn't announce that it was an AI, just like now you call a call center and say, for regulatory purposes, I have to inform you that this call will be recorded, blah, blah, blah. So it should be the same with AI. And then if people still choose to have a romantic relationship with their AI,
or their fridge.
It's like somebody have a romantic relationship with their car or with their fridge. It's the same. Yeah, you cannot stop them from having certain interests. But as long as you inform them properly in advance, it's more deceptive, AI, clearly. But you should tell them that it's a computer that they're talking to. And then I would say still that Microsoft would be right. I have not seen the use case in Deutsche Telekom where we would actually stop a conversation if you see it going completely off the rails because it's used for something that it's not intended for. But that also means you need to monitor actively the content of every conversation, which again is kind of, questionable. So
it's very hard to do.
Yeah, or give the option to the adopters and the adopter companies, not to say, do you want this kind of monitoring? Are you implementing this kind of monitoring by yourself? I have clients that are doing that. They're saying, okay, we don't use the by default option. You can deactivate it, no problem. But we are aware that in terms of accountability, we need to do something. You cannot just leave it and then let's see what happens.
We're not responsible for any emotional damage that may have been caused by our romantic interaction with our chatbot. Yes. Yes.
Mr. Barr wanted to say something.
I just want to say it's also very difficult to do that content monitoring at scale. And I think current methodologies are kind of failing. It's very easy to, as you mentioned, jailbreak all these systems. And I think we haven't talked about all the open source, all the risks that open source technologies introduce.
We should.
I'm glad you brought it up.
You essentially have zero control over how it's being used and implemented. So there's no content moderation or content monitoring. And I also just want to very briefly come back to the romantic stuff because I think it got a little bit sidetracked. So there is, of course, an enormous kind of mental health epidemic around the world. Like we know that there's an epidemic of loneliness, mental health issues are on the rise, and one of the ways in which we might be able to meet that demand is through the use of these chatbot-based solutions. But that's, again, introducing a very fundamental change to how humans start relating to artificial entities. Of course, the romantic case is one edge case, which we might joke about, but there are very, very serious applications where we are very deeply intervening into interpersonal relationships with these technologies, and we have really no idea how to think about the kind of downstream ramifications. I just wanted to put that back.
It's still safer than, you're right, but in my opinion, it's still safer than all these people that are hiding behind another ID and manipulate people. You have no idea who you are talking to, and without some kind of quality check on that side, I still think an AI is relatively safe compared to really malicious people that are doing that every day and are stealing from people or abusing them. So I agree with you, but I still think AI is at a stage where it is not as damaging as, for instance, a lot of other internet piracy.
So we will talk about AI safety and security in the second panel, and I don't want to take away the earnings of the ladies and gentlemen who will be part of that. So let's talk a little bit more about what is one of my pet peeves. So hailing from Silicon Valley for long years, I have been hearing on the ground from the representatives of various big tech companies as well as startups is like regulation is absolutely banned, you know, like there's nothing good that's coming, especially if it's Europe, come on. So that was my personal lived US experience. However, I would say that in the last year or so, the tone has changed radically. Yeah. And first it started with, you know, some CEOs. So basically, the question has been elevated from question number 10 to question number 1 in most of the interviews with Satya Nadella and all the other CEOs of big tech platforms. So from the obscurity of an afterthought, this emerged to be the #1 problem, and there were open letters, and CEOs started talking about existential risks, and you know these kinds of things. So what is your take on that? Why this phenomenon happened, that it became top of the mind issue for the big technology companies? How much is it authentic? How much is it driven by sheer business objectives? I would really want your, you know, somewhat inside take on that.
I think it was very positive to see the wave of reactions for one way and the other, just to see everyone was saying we need a regulation. Yeah. Like I remember being in Montreal teaching there, and as a European, as an individual, saying like regulation is not a bad thing per se. Like regulation is something necessary that has to be applied in a pragmatic way that doesn't stop innovation. Easier to say than to do. Right? But in any case, like I think like the reaction after the ChatGPT and all the stuff was very positive because everyone agreed that finally Europe was right. Europe was right. They started, we started 2 years ago with the AI Act, with the draft. It's taking long, whatever, but it's more advanced than what I have seen in Canada, in the United States, or the interim measures in China, or whatever country. So I think that that's already good. And it's a personal point of view, the reactions, the extreme reactions about artificial intelligence, the potential damage and stuff, I think that there was like a bit of a shock in the academia. I can talk about the academia in Canada that I know better than here in Europe. I know that it was a shock because you're thinking you are working on research and exploring technology as suddenly a private company, which is not even one of the biggest. It's just a small company called OpenAI, disrupts everything. So what's your mission as a researcher? So I think that there was a bit of that. And then it was very interesting to see from a society point of view, the evolution of the discussions. You mentioned like some researchers are affiliated to Meta, etc. They made their message softer, like, because in the beginning they were talking about the generative AI, and then it was fine, even people from Hugging Face, etc. So I think like obviously there are a lot of different interests from different companies, but in general, the conclusion that we can get is that the European approach was right. Now it's time to implement and to adopt and to collaborate public and private institutions. But that's my main outcome of that.
And also, it's important for companies because we need guidance, we need structure, and there's a lot of things right now. Just even if we want to be internationally more relevant, if we just talk about the commercial aspect of it, the damage of going deep into a certain development and then finding out that later you're actually going to be regulated and you have to redo the whole thing is already, you know, financially a very costly affair, like GDPR, for instance, was for most companies a very costly affair to implement it. But also, it makes things easier. Once we know how individual data is, you know, protected, or how we could create digital IDs for everyone, it would make all of our lives easier. It makes you safer as a consumer, but it makes also our lives easier if there are international principles. Phone companies are only able to operate based on international principles. It would only work in one location if you would agree on the rules for one location. And the same goes for operating on database services and AI. If you have certain principles, accountability principles, transparency principles, and also individual data protection principles embedded into an international principle, it would make everybody's life, and then you can hold those open source boys accountable as well, which are now flying under the radar for pretty much everything. You could hold everybody accountable. So we're now talking about the big platforms, but imagine what would happen in, I would say, okay, roll the dice, 5 years from now. Not just the big platforms, but anyone medium size could have the same knowledge and capabilities on AI. If you don't have any regulation by then, it's like America with their guns, right? So everyone would walk around with an extremely powerful capability, use it as they interpret it, or, you know, at least the large corporations usually, from a governance perspective, have to adhere to certain ethical standards. But the medium-sized companies it's up to them, right? So governance and laws around this and simple principles that we can all adhere to, even if they are a little bit limiting at the beginning and we will evolve them later on, are absolutely key for us as a business as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. I guess just one thing to add is that it's very important and that also the authorities are sufficiently capable to enforce the regulations, that they are sufficiently funded and they are sufficiently staffed so that they can actually give teeth or actual power to these regulations. So I think that's an important aspect.
I like the sandbox thing. That's really good. We did it in Germany as well. But we could go beyond that and have because there is a shortage in high-end, deep AI knowledge, even for us. We're growing them by ourselves now because, you cannot find enough on the market, so the shortage anyway. But it is in our interest that governments and policymakers are very well informed and technically also quite capable of understanding AI. So it is also in the industry's interest that we jointly invest in this knowledge, that it's not governance kind of giving us general principles, still very difficult for us to implement. The implementation part is really, really important. And they're consulting with business and a society of users for government and having real knowledge of how that would impact the use of AI is really important. So I would agree with that. We need to hard shift into that. And both business as well as government needs to invest in that.
And I think government and regulation and governance, the domain of governance in general has a lot to learn from technology regarding the agility of making things work.
True, yeah.
I've been exploring the thought of the day coming when on the screen, when it comes up, are you a robot? I can ask back, well, are you? And on a quick note, a teaser for a later moment of the conference, we have a very distinguished speaker to talk about a lot of those notions, definitions, and words, transparency, accountability, and how chaotically diverse the definitions attached to those are, and how important it is to harmonize what we mean by transparency, accountability. At a later point coming in the conference, I'd like to express my gratitude to the gentlemen here for their thoughts, and let's give a big round of applause to the panelists.